On a tropical shore, the greatest navigator the world had ever known waded into shallow water and into a trap that would end his legend forever. April 27th, 1521. The sun rose over Mactan Island like a blade drawn from its sheath, casting long shadows across white sand and coral reefs that glittered beneath water so clear you could count the stones on. Bottom, the air hung thick with salt and heat, carrying the calls of distant birds and the rhythmic crash of waves against the outer reef. Palm fronds rustled in the morning breeze. The sky burned pink and gold, promising heat and violence. On the beach, more than 1,000 warriors waited in silence. Their bodies were painted for war. Red ochre and charcoal, symbols of protection and power that their fathers and grandfathers had worn into battle. They carried spears tipped with fire-hardened wood and iron points traded from Bornean merchants. They held campolane swords, their blades swelling at the tip like the head of a serpent. They gripped bows strung with fiber, shields woven from rattan and hardwood. Some wore armor of their own, thick cotton quilted to turn aside blades, bamboo slats bound across their chests. They stood in loose formations along the waterline and in the tree line beyond, watching the channel where 3 foreign ships rode at anchor. In that channel, rolling gently on the tide, the Spanish vessels seemed like floating fortresses from another world. Their hulls were scarred from months at sea, their sails patched and stained. Aboard them, men in steel breastplates and Morian helmets gathered at the rails, staring toward the shore with expressions that mixed confidence and unease. They had sailed halfway around the world to reach these islands. They had endured storms that should have killed them, crossed an ocean so vast it had no name on any European map. They had survived mutiny, starvation, scurvy, and shipwreck. Their commander had promised them glory, gold, and the conversion of souls to the one true faith. Now that commander stood in a longboat cutting through the shallows, his armor flashing in the dawn light, a crossbow in his hands. Ferdinand Magellan, Captain General of the greatest voyage in human history. The man who had found the passage between 2 oceans, who had crossed the Pacific in a journey that rewrote every map, was about to wade onto a beach that would become his grave. He had circumnavigated the known world. He had achieved what geographers said was impossible. He had reached the Spice Islands by sailing west instead of east, proving that the earth was round and that all its waters connected. He had endured hardships that would have broken lesser men, but on this beach none of that mattered. Here, on an island whose name most Europeans would never even hear, the laws of empire and faith would be tested against something older and more primal. The will of men defending their home. What happened in the shallows of Mactan that morning would shatter the myth of European invincibility in the East. It would prove that steel armor and gunpowder were not enough to conquer men who refused to kneel. And it would write the name of a Filipino chieftain, Lapu-Lapu, into legend as the first indigenous leader to defeat a European colonial force in Southeast Asia. This is the story of the battle that killed Magellan. To understand how Ferdinand Magellan came to die in the surf of a tropical island, you must first understand the forces that brought him there. Ambition that knew no limits, faith that borked no compromise, and the hunger for spices that drove European empires into waters they did not know and could not imagine. In the early 16th century, the kingdoms of Spain and Portugal had divided the entire world between them. Through a series of papal decrees and treaties, most notably the Treaty of Torrillas in 1494, they drew a line through the globe, splitting the earth into Spanish and Portuguese spheres of influence. Portugal claimed the eastern route to the Indies around the southern tip of Africa, through the Indian Ocean to the legendary Spice Islands, where nutmeg, cloves, and pepper grew in abundance. These spices were worth more than gold in European markets, capable of preserving food, masking the taste of spoilage, and serving as medicine. Control of the spice trade meant wealth beyond measure. Spain claimed everything to the west, but there was a problem. No one knew how far west you would have to sail to reach those same islands. No one knew if the Americas, discovered by Columbus only a generation before, were a barrier, or if a passage existed through them, a strait that would let ships pass from the Atlantic to whatever ocean lay beyond. The Pacific had not yet been crossed. Its size was unknown. Most European sailors believed Asia lay just a few weeks' sail beyond the American coast. Ferdinand Magellan believed otherwise, and he believed he could find the passage. Born into minor Portuguese nobility around 1480, Magellan had served his country in the East Indies, fighting in brutal campaigns in Goa, Malacca, and the Moluccas. He learned navigation and warfare in those waters. He saw the wealth that flowed through Asian ports. He studied charts and spoke with Arab and Chinese navigators, who knew routes the Portuguese were only beginning to discover. And he became convinced that the Spice Islands could be reached by sailing west, that they might even fall within Spain's sphere of influence if you measured longitude correctly from the western side of the world. When the Portuguese king rejected his proposal, calling it expensive and foolish, Magellan did what ambitious men have always done when their own rulers refused them. He went to Portugal's rival. In 1518, he arrived in Seville and presented his plan to the young King Charles I of Spain, soon to be crowned Holy Roman Emperor as Charles V. The king, barely 18 years old and eager to match Portuguese expansion, gave Magellan 5 ships and 237 men. The mission: find the western route to the Spice Islands and claim them for Spain. What followed was an odyssey of suffering and wonder that would become legend. Magellan's fleet crossed the Atlantic in 1519, sailed down the coast of South America, and spent agonizing months searching for the passage. The southern winter came, bringing storms that tore sails and cracked masts. Ships were driven onto rocks, men froze in their hammocks. And when mutiny broke out, captains questioning Magellan's leadership, demanding they turn back, he crushed it with hangings, executions, and marooning. He left mutineers on desolate shores to die slowly. He was not a man who tolerated dissent. In October 1520, he found it. The strait at the southern tip of the continent, a maze of channels and cliffs where the Atlantic met another ocean. The passage was treacherous, full of rocks and contrary winds. One ship deserted and fled back to Spain. Another was wrecked, but 3 ships made it through, emerging into calm blue water that stretched to the horizon. Magellan named it the Pacific, the peaceful ocean, because after the storms of the strait, its surface seemed so tranquil. He had no idea how vast it was. For 3 months and 20 days, the fleet sailed west across water that never ended. Day after day they saw nothing but ocean and sky. The food ran out, then the water. Men died of scurvy, their gums rotting, their teeth falling out, their bodies covered in sores. They ate sawdust and biscuit powder, crawling with weevils. They boiled leather straps from the rigging and chewed them for sustenance. They caught rats and sold them as delicacies. 19 men died on that crossing. More went mad. And then, in March 1521, they reached land. Islands rose from the horizon, green mountains, white beaches, the smell of vegetation after 3 months of salt and death. They had found the Philippines, though they did not know that name. They had sailed around the world, but survival and glory were not the same thing. Magellan's fleet was broken. Of the 5 ships that had left Spain, only 3 remained, and one of those would soon be lost. His men were sick and starving, reduced to shadows of themselves, and now, anchored off these tropical islands, Magellan saw a new mission, one that had nothing to do with spices or navigation. He would convert these lands to Christianity. He would bring them under Spanish dominion. he would prove that faith and steel could remake the world in Europe's image. It was that mission more than any storm or reef that would kill him. The people of the Visayas, the central Philippine islands where Magellan made landfall, did not need saving or remaking. They lived in sophisticated networks of barangays, settlements ruled by Dadist chieftains who commanded loyalty through kinship, military prowess, and control of trade. These were not isolated tribes living in primitive ignorance. They were sailors and traders whose prores, swift outrigger canoes, cut across the channels between islands, carrying gold, iron, slaves, and alliances. They smelted metal, wove textiles, and built homes on stilts above the water. They practiced a complex blend of animism, ancestor worship, and Islam, depending on the island and the influence of traders from the Malay and Indonesian sultanates. When Magellan arrived in Cebu, the largest and most powerful settlement in the region in early April 1521, he found a thriving port town. Raja Humaborn ruled Cebu with his wife Harahumame and commanded tribute from smaller islands across the Visayas. The Raja was pragmatic, intelligent, and curious about these strange foreigners with their great ships and thundersticks. He saw opportunity. An alliance with men who possessed such weapons might strengthen his position against rivals and expand his influence. Magellan saw something else: souls to be saved and lands to be claimed. He believed that converting the Philippines would secure his legacy as more than just a navigator. He would be remembered as the man who brought Christ to the East. The fact that many Filipinos already practiced Islam, a faith he considered heretical, only strengthened his resolve. On April 14, 1521, in a ceremony that mixed European ritual with local pragmatism, Raja Humaban and his family converted to Christianity. Whether this conversion was genuine or a political calculation to maintain good relations with powerful foreigners, no one could say. Humaban accepted baptism, took the name Charles in honor of the Spanish king, and allowed Magellan to plant a wooden cross on the beach. Hundreds of Cebuanos followed their rager into the faith. It seemed a bloodless triumph, a vindication of Magellan's belief that these people were ready to embrace European religion and authority. But not everyone knelt. Across the narrow channel separating Cebu from the neighboring island of Mactan, a chieftain named Lapu-Lapu ruled his own barangay. He owed no allegiance to Humaban. The two were rivals, competitors for dominance in the region, their relationship marked by raiding, tribute disputes, and shifting alliances. When word reached Lapu-Lapu that Humeb had accepted baptism and submitted to the foreign god and foreign king, Lapu-Lapu saw it for what it was: weakness disguised as diplomacy. When Magellan sent emissaries to Mactan demanding that Lapu-Lapu acknowledge Spanish sovereignty, pay tribute, and convert to Christianity, the chieftain's response was simple and final. No, he would not kneel to strangers. He would not abandon the spirits of his ancestors. He would not surrender his independence to men whose ships would eventually sail away. Raja Humiban saw an opportunity. If Magellan could defeat Lapu-Lapu, it would accomplish two things at once. It would prove the power of the Spanish and their god, and it would eliminate Humaban's rival, consolidating his own control over the region. He urged Magellan to take action, painting Lapu-Lapu as a rebel against the natural order, a stubborn fool who needed to be taught a lesson. Magellan, driven by pride, faith, and the belief that his armor made him invincible, agreed. He would crush this defiance. He would show what happened to those who refused the authority of Spain and the Church. He would burn Lapu-Lapu's village and force the chieftain to submit or die. He believed his crossbows and muskets could scatter any number of warriors armed with spears and wooden swords. He believed his steel breastplates would turn aside their weapons, as if they were children's tar. He believed God fought on his side, that divine providence had guided him around the world, and would not abandon him now. He was about to learn that courage and steel were not the same as wisdom, and that underestimating an enemy on his own ground was a mistake that no amount of armor could protect against. The decision to attack Mactan was made not out of strategic necessity, but out of arrogance disguised as confidence. Magellan had seen what European weapons could do against indigenous warriors in Malacca and the Moluccas. A single volley of musket fire, he believed, could break any native charge. Armor made a man nearly invulnerable to arrows and spears. Crossbows could kill from distances. Wooden bows could never match. The warriors of these islands, brave as they might be in their own way, had no answer to the technology and discipline of European warfare. But others in the Spanish fleet harbored doubts. Antonio Pigafetta, an Italian scholar and gentleman who had joined the expedition to document its discoveries, recorded those concerns in his journal. Some of the Spanish captains urged Magellan not to go personally. They argued that the captain general was too valuable to risk in what amounted to a punitive raid. Let subordinates handle it. Let Cebuano allies do the fighting. There was no need for Magellan himself to wade into combat against warriors he considered beneath him. Magellan refused. He would lead from the front, as he always had. To send others in his place would be to show weakness, to suggest he feared these islanders. Besides, the tactical situation seemed laughably easy. Mactan was a small island. Lapu-Lapu commanded perhaps 1,000 or 500 men, poorly armed, undisciplined, with no experience fighting Europeans. A small force of well-armed Spaniards could scatter them, burn their villages, and return to the ships before noon. But there were problems Magellan either did not see or chose to ignore. The channel between Cebu and Mactan was treacherous, full of coral reefs and sandbars that shifted with the tide. The Spanish ships could not sail close enough to shore to provide covering fire with their cannons. Any landing would have to be made in long boats, and the men would have to wade the final distance through shallows, where firearms were difficult to use, and reload. The warriors of Mactan knew every rock and current. They had the advantage of numbers, and they would be fighting to defend their homes. Always the most desperate and effective motivation, Antonio Pigafetta noted another concern. The Cebuano allies pledged by Humabin seemed reluctant. Many of them had relatives on Mactan. Others simply did not want to fight their neighbors in a war that served Spanish interests rather than their own. When the time came to board the boats, only a handful of Cebuanos accompanied the Spanish, and even they hung back, clearly unwilling to commit fully to the attack. Magellan dismissed all objections. On the night of April 26th, he gave orders for the assault to take place at dawn when the tide would be high enough, he thought, for the boats to get close to shore. He would take 60 men total, 49 Europeans and 11 native allies. They would wear full armor, carry crossbows and muskets, and bring torches to set fire to Lapu-Lapu's village. It would be a quick, brutal lesson in the cost of defying Spanish authority. He left the bulk of his forces on the ships. There was no need, he believed, to bring everyone. This was not a battle. It was a demonstration. Across the water on Mactan, Lapu-Lapu knew they were coming. The warriors of Mactan had spent weeks watching the Spanish. They had seen the great ships arrive, seen the strangers in their metal shells, heard the thunder of their guns. They had watched Hummer kneel and convert. They knew what Magellan wanted: submission, tribute, baptism, and they knew what he would do if refused. Lapu-Lapu was not a young man. Accounts describe him as perhaps 50 or 60 years old, ancient by the standards of 16th century warfare, where most fighters died young, but age had not weakened him. He was a veteran of countless inter-island raids and skirmishes, a man who had earned his position through proven courage and tactical skill. He commanded perhaps 500 warriors, though exact numbers were never recorded. What mattered was not the precise count, but the overwhelming advantage he held in manpower and knowledge of the terrain. His warriors were not professional soldiers in the European sense. They were farmers, fishermen, and craftsmen who picked up weapons when needed, but they were far from the undisciplined mob Magellan imagined. Inter-island warfare in the Visayas was constant, driven by competition for resources, slaves, and tribute. These men had fought before. They knew how to move in formation, how to use terrain, how to coordinate attacks. They were armed with weapons that might seem primitive to European eyes, but were deadly effective in skilled hands. Campbellinden swords with blades that could sever limbs, spears with fire-hardened points that could pierce quilted armor, bows that could fire faster than crossbows, and stones for throwing that could crack skulls through helmets. More importantly, they knew the beach. They knew where the coral reefs lurked beneath the surface. They knew how deep the water would be at different stages of the tide. They knew where the sand was firm and where it turned to mud that would suck at a man's legs. They knew the Spanish would have to wade through chest-deep water while weighed down by armor. Water where guns could not be kept dry, where crossbow strings would slacken, where every step would be a struggle. Lapu-Lapu positioned his forces carefully. He did not gather everyone on the beach, where they would be visible and vulnerable to the Spanish ships' guns, if those guns could reach the shore, which they could not because of the reefs. Instead, he kept the bulk of his warriors in the Triine and in the village beyond, hidden from view. A smaller force would be positioned on the beach itself to meet the initial landing. When the Spanish committed to their attack and waded into the shallows, that's when the main force would emerge. The foreigners would be trapped between the deep water behind them and overwhelming numbers in front. It was a simple plan. It required no complex maneuvers or sophisticated tactics. It relied on patience, discipline, and the willingness to let the enemy make the first mistake. On the night of April 26th, as the Spanish prepared their weapons and armor, the warriors of Mactan prepared their spirits. Fires burned along the beach. Drums beat in rhythms that carried across the water, low, steady, ominous. The warriors chanted, invoking their ancestors and the spirits of land and sea. Shamans performed rituals of protection, painting symbols on skin and weapons. There was no fear in those preparations. These were men defending their homes against invaders who believed themselves gods. If the Spanish wanted a fight, Mactan would give them one they would never forget. Lapu-Lapu stood among his warriors as dawn approached. He knew the stakes. If the Spanish won, it would not just be his village that burned. It would be the independence of every barangay in the Visayas. Humaban's submission would become the template for conquest. Other chieftains would kneel rather than fight. The foreigners would spread across the islands like a plague, demanding tribute and conversion, remaking everything in their image. But if the Spanish lost, if their famous armor and weapons failed, it would prove something profound. That resistance was possible, that these invaders could be beaten, that submission was not inevitable. The answer would be written in the shallows of Mactan at dawn. The Spanish boats left the ships in the dark hours before dawn. 3 longboats carried Magellan and his men toward the black outline of Mactan Island. The oars dipped and pulled through water that glowed with phosphorescence, each stroke leaving trails of blue-green light. Above, stars faded as the sky began to pale. The air was cool, almost pleasant, the last comfortable moments before the tropical heat returned. Magellan stood in the lead boat, his armor strapped tight, his crossbow cradled in his arms. Around him, 48 other Europeans prepared for battle. Spaniards, Portuguese, Italians, and a few Greeks and Germans who had joined the expedition for pay and adventure. They wore whatever armor they possessed, some in full breastplates and back plates, others with just helmets and leather jerkins. They carried crossbows, matchlock muskets, swords, and daggers. A few bore torches, ready to set fires once they reached the village. 11 native allies from Cebu huddled in the other boats, quiet and visibly reluctant. The plan was straightforward. Land on the beach, fire a volley to scatter any defenders, march inland to Lapu-Lapu's village, burn it to the ground, and return to the ships before the sun climbed high. It would take an hour, perhaps 2. By midday, they would be back aboard the ships, and Lapu-Lapu would be a broken man begging for mercy. As the boats approached the shore, the first light of dawn revealed the island's outline. Palm trees swayed against the sky, turning from purple to pink. The beach stretched pale and empty. No warriors visible, no movement in the treeline. For a moment, some of the Spanish wondered if Lapu-Lapu had fled, if the mere sight of their approach had been enough to scatter his forces. Then the tide betrayed them. The boats grounded far from shore. 2 crossbow shots, perhaps 150 yards, stopped by coral reefs and sandbars that the rising tide had not yet covered. The water between the boats and the beach was shallow, but it was deep enough to make walking treacherous, deep enough that a man in armor would struggle. Magellan had timed the attack for high tide, but he had miscalculated. The boats could go no farther. From the ships anchored in the deeper channel, the Spanish captains watched with growing alarm. They could not provide covering fire at this distance. The reefs blocked any approach. If something went wrong, there would be no way to support Magellan's force. Some shouted warnings across the water, but Magellan either did not hear or chose not to listen. He ordered his men into the water. 59 Europeans and Cebuanos climbed out of the boats and began wading toward shore. The water came up to their thighs, sometimes their waists. The bottom was uneven, firm sand in some places, sucking mud in others, sharp coral that cut through boots. Men stumbled and cursed. Their armor designed to protect against swords and arrows became a burden, dragging at every step. Musketeers held their weapons high to keep the powder dry. Crossbowmen struggled to keep their strings taut in the humid air. The sun broke the horizon, flooding the beach with golden light, and on that beach warriors began to appear. They emerged from the treeline in groups of 10, 20, 50. More came from the village beyond. Within minutes, the beach was filled with them. 1,000 men, perhaps more, their bodies painted for war, their weapons catching the sun. They did not charge. They stood in loose formations, shields raised, spears ready, watching the foreigners wade through the shallows like men walking through a nightmare. Magellan reached water shallow enough to stand firmly. He raised his hand, forming his men into a rough line. 49 Europeans spread across perhaps 50 yards of waterline, with a handful of Cebuano allies hanging back, clearly unwilling to advance farther. The distance to the beach was still 30 yards. The warriors of Mactan waited just beyond the waterline, close enough that Magellan could see the paint on their bodies, the iron points on their spears. He gave the order. Musketeers raised their weapons and fired. The sound cracked across the water like thunder rolling over the sea. White smoke billowed, crossbows twanged, sending bolts flying toward the mass of warriors. For a moment the Spanish believed it was working. The thunderous noise, the smoke, the demonstration of power. Then the smoke cleared, and the warriors were still there. A few had fallen, perhaps 3, perhaps 5. The rest stood their ground, shields raised, utterly unshaken. At that distance, in that chaos, with damp powder and weapons fouled by salt water, the Spanish guns were far less effective than they had been in controlled demonstrations. Muskballs passed through empty air or thudded harmlessly into wooden shields. Crossbow bolts struck armor made of thick quilted cotton or glanced off camp swords raised in deflection. And then the warriors of Mactan answered. They came forward not as a disorganized mob, but in coordinated waves. Shield-bearers advanced in the front ranks, their rattan shields overlapping to form a moving wall. Behind them, spearmen kept formation, their weapons bristling like a palisade. On the flanks, archers raised their bows and fired, not a single volley, but a steady rain of arrows that hissed through the air and clattered against Spanish armor. Slingers whirled stones overhead and released them in arcing trajectories that cracked against helmets with sounds like hammers striking anvils. The Spanish fired again, another volley of musket smoke and crossbow bolts. A few more warriors fell, but the rest kept coming. They closed the distance rapidly, splashing into the shallows, their voices rising in war cries that turned the beach into a wall of sound. Magellan realized too late the fatal flaw in his plan. His guns were devastating in open field battles where you could form lines, reload in safety, and fire volley after volley into packed formations. But here, standing in waist-deep water, weighed down by armor, surrounded by enemies who could move faster and strike from all directions, here the guns were almost useless. Musketeers could fire once, perhaps twice, before the enemy was on them. Crossbows required 2 hands to reload. Time the soldiers did not have. Swords and daggers were better suited to this chaos, but the Spanish were vastly outnumbered. For every warrior who fell, 10 more surged forward. Spears flew through the air, targeting legs and arms where armor was absent or thin. Stones smashed into visors and helmets, denting metal and stunning the men inside. Arrows found gaps in armor under the arms, at the neck, behind the knees. Men shouted in Spanish and Portuguese, trying to form up, trying to create a defensive line, but the water made it impossible. They could not move quickly, they could not maneuver, they were targets, and the warriors of Mactan knew it. The Tuano allies broke first. They turned and fled back toward the boats, abandoning the Spanish entirely. Some of the Europeans tried to follow, realizing the battle was already lost, but Magellan's voice rang out above the chaos, ordering them to hold. He would not retreat, he would not show weakness. He fired his crossbow again and again, each bolt finding a target, each killing a man. But it was like trying to empty the ocean 1 cup at a time. The Spanish line buckled. Warriors closed in from the flanks, cutting off retreat, isolating groups of soldiers. Men went down in the surf, dragged under the water by multiple attackers, their armor turning from protection into a death sentence as they drowned under its weight. Swords flashed, spears thrust, blood spread across the water in dark clouds. Magellan tried to hold the center, firing and reloading with desperate speed. Around him, his captains and sergeants fought to maintain some semblance of order, but the situation was collapsing. Antonio Pigafetta, wounded by an arrow in the leg, stayed close to Magellan, recording in his mind the details of what would become one of the most famous battles in Philippine history. And then the warriors focused on Magellan himself. They recognized him, the leader in the finest armor, the one standing at the center giving orders, the one the others looked to for courage. In any battle, ancient or modern, the death of the commander can break an army's will. Lapu-Lapu's warriors knew this. If they killed the man in the brightest steel, the foreigners would flee. The victory would be complete. Spears began flying toward Magellan with concentrated intensity. He raised his shield, deflecting some, taking hits on his breastplate that rang like bells. A spear grazed his helmet, snapping his head to the side. Another struck his left leg below the knee, punching through cloth and leather to pierce flesh. He staggered but did not fall, shouting orders even as blood ran down into his boot. More warriors pressed close, too close for crossbows or guns. Magellan dropped his crossbow and drew his sword, a fine European blade, probably made in Toledo, capable of cutting through bamboo with a single stroke. He slashed at the nearest warrior, driving him back, then turned and cut down another. His skill with a blade was undeniable. He had fought in a dozen battles from Portugal to the Moluccas, but skill alone could not overcome numbers. A stone struck his face, shattering the visor of his helmet and bloodying his nose. He stumbled. Warriors surged forward, sensing weakness. Campbell's swords hacked at his legs, targeting the unarmored flesh. One blade opened a deep gash in his right thigh. Another cut across his sword arm, severing muscle. His blade fell from nerveless fingers, splashing into the water. Around him the Spanish were dying. Of the 49 who had waded ashore, perhaps 24 were still alive, and most of those were fleeing now, scrambling back toward the boats in panic. The ones who remained were the bravest or the most trapped, men fighting back to back, surrounded, knowing they would not leave this beach alive. Magellan tried to draw his dagger with his left hand, but there were too many attackers. They came from every direction. Spears thrusting, swords slashing, stones flying. He took a camper blow to the back of his neck, cutting through the leather collar that protected the gap between his helmet and breastplate. Blood poured down his armor. He fell forward into the water, landing on his hands and knees, the surf washing over him. The warriors swarmed over him in the chaos and violence of those final moments. No one could say with certainty which blow killed him. Some accounts say a compellant to the neck severed his spine. Others claim a spear through the chest pierced his heart. Still others suggest he drowned in the shallow water, held down by the weight of his armor and the press of bodies. It did not matter. Ferdinand Magellan, the man who had sailed around the world, the navigator who had found the passage between oceans, the explorer who had crossed the Pacific and reached the east by sailing west. He died in knee-deep water on a beach he had never heard of 6 months before, killed by men he had thought beneath him. Antonio Pigafetta, wounded and bleeding, fought his way back to the boats. He would survive to write the account that became the primary source for the Battle of Mactan. In his journal, he recorded Magellan's final moments with a mixture of grief and awe. Thus, they killed our mirror, our light, our comfort, and our true guide. But the battle was not over. The warriors turned their attention to the fleeing Spanish, chasing them into the surf, dragging them down, finishing the wounded. Armor that had protected against arrows became a drowning weight in the water. Men screamed for mercy in languages the warriors did not understand. Some surrendered and were taken alive. Most were killed where they fell. Of the 49 Europeans who had waded onto that beach, only 12 made it back to the boats. They rowed with desperate strength, arrows and stones splashing in the water around them, back to the ships where the rest of the fleet watched in horror and disbelief. The sun climbed higher over man, burning away the morning haze. The tide rolled in, washing blood into the reef, carrying bodies into deeper water. The beach was littered with broken weapons, shattered shields, and the corpses of men from 2 worlds who had met in violence. The warriors of Mactan raised their weapons and chanted victory. They had done what no other indigenous force in Southeast Asia had yet accomplished. They had defeated a European expedition in open battle, killed its commander, and sent the survivors fleeing. They had proven that the foreigners were not invincible, that their thunder sticks and metal shells could be overcome by courage, numbers, and knowledge of the land. For Lapu-Lapu, the victory was both tactical and symbolic. His warriors had defended their home against an enemy who believed conquest was inevitable. They had refused to kneel to foreign gods or foreign kings. They had sent a message that would echo across the archipelago. Resistance was possible. The Spanish did not recover Magellan's body. Lapu-Lapu refused all offers and all ransoms. Some accounts say he kept it as a trophy of war, proof that he had killed the great navigator. Others claim he offered it to the sea as a warning to any who would follow. Whatever the truth, Magellan's corpse remained on Mactan, absorbed into the land he had tried to conquer. The surviving Spanish fled Cebu within days. Without Magellan's leadership, the expedition fell apart. They burned one of their ships, the Conquest, because they no longer had enough men to crew it. They executed several Tabuano converts they no longer trusted. Fearing treachery, they sailed south in disarray, eventually reaching the Spice Islands, but losing another ship along the way. In September 1522, more than 3 years after leaving Spain, the Victoria, the last surviving ship, limped into Seville harbor with 18 emaciated men aboard. They had circumnavigated the globe, the first humans in history to do so, but they had paid for that achievement with the lives of 219 men and 4 ships. And their commander, the man whose vision and stubbornness had driven them around the world, lay dead on a beach 10,000 miles away. His name forever linked not just with discovery, but with the price of arrogance. The waves rolled in over the reef where Ferdinand Magellan died. The tide washed the blood away, palm effarons rustled in the wind, birds returned to the trees. By afternoon the beach looked almost as it had before dawn. Just another stretch of sand on just another island in a vast archipelago. But the memory remained. The memory of warriors who refused to submit. The memory of a chieftain who chose freedom over safety. The memory of a battle that proved courage and conviction could defeat steel and gunpowder when the ground was right and the will was strong. The Spanish would return to the Philippines decades later with more ships and more soldiers and more priests. They would conquer most of the archipelago, converting millions and ruling for more than 3 centuries. But they never truly conquered the spirit that Lapu-Lapu embodied on that beach. The refusal to accept that submission was inevitable. The knowledge that invaders could be resisted. In the centuries that followed, Lapu-Lapu became a symbol of Filipino resistance and independence. Statues rose in his honor. Streets bore his name. He became the first hero in a long struggle against colonial powers that would eventually lead to independence. The Battle of Mactan became the opening chapter in that story, a reminder that even when the enemy seems overwhelming, when their weapons seem unstoppable, when their confidence seems absolute, they can still bleed. They can still fall. They can still be beaten. When the sun set on Mactan that day, an empire's dream died with the man who had sailed around the world. The age of easy conquest ended before it could truly begin, and in the shallow water where Magellan fell, the tide turned. Not just for one battle, but for the idea that faith and steel alone could remake the world without resistance. The warriors of Mactan had held the beach, the invader had fallen, and the story of what happened there would echo across centuries. A testament to the power of free men fighting for their home.